Welcome, everybody. I think we have to start. I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of the National Foresight Network under the umbrella of Foresight Friday. My name is Jaana Tapanainen-Thiess, and I'm from the Strategy Department from the Prime Minister's Office. We have an exciting day ahead. It will be quite fast-paced. I do hope you enjoy the discussions in the groups you have chosen for today. I do hope you know which group you registered in, as we have divided the rooms based on the number of people in each group. As we only have 1 hour for the workshop, I do hope that the transition straight after the presentation of the National Intelligence Council will be smooth. You can find a printed layout of the House of the Commons, which the groups have been marked in. I would also ask you to be on time after the workshop, as the event is broadcasted live starting 10:15. Enjoy your day. We are honored to have our State Secretary to the Prime Minister, Mr. Mikko Koskinen, with us today, and he will be giving us the opening address. Please welcome the State Secretary. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guests from National Intelligence Council, dear colleagues, friends, and practitioners of Foresight. I'm happy to welcome you all at the House of Commons for this Foresight Friday around National Intelligence Council global trends. We look forward to this day to interesting discussions and work on 5 global trends shaping the future. We are pleased to participate and give insights from Finland to the preparations of the next Global Trends report. The world around us is changing fast. Our government program starts with acknowledging the changes shaping our future. The first sentence of our government program states, "Climate change, globalization, urbanization, the aging of population and technological development are all transforming Finland and the world perhaps faster than ever before. Our Nordic welfare society is a sustainable, fair and just model that enables us to respond to the challenges. However, the changing world and future challenges mean we must reform and further strengthen the Nordic model as we have entered the 2020s and prepare us for the 2030s. Our aim is to transform Finland into socially, economically and ecologically sustainable society by 2030. And this is at the core of our government program. A socially, economically and ecologically sustainable society is the common cause of action for all the 5 parties in this government, and it is also the common cause of actions for all in Finland. It narrows any divisions we might have. In this work, the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development paves the way. Ladies and gentlemen, the changes and challenges we are facing require new ways of thinking and working. Therefore, we adopted a new way to prepare the government program. We introduced a phenomena-based approach into government negotiations. This was a new and different way of creating a shared understanding of the situation and of the connections and interdependencies. We identified 8 strategic themes with which we will set about building a socially, economically and ecologically sustainable Finland. This approach emphasized the need for cooperation and strategic work across the sectors, as the great challenges of our time are not only limited to the administrative branches of different ministers, but also are increasingly multisectoral in nature. Doing things well requires working together across ministries. The 8 strategic themes in our government program all start with the statement of our shared understanding of the current situation, followed with the objectives and the measures to achieve them. We keep the government's shared understanding of current situation up to date, supporting the implementation of the government's main objectives. We also want to reform our political culture and decision-making to achieve socially, economically and ecologically sustainable Finland. Reforming society and increasing equality can succeed only if we strengthen people's trust in the ability of our democratic system to function. This is why we have made pledges on policy reforms to our citizens. The pledges include a pledge for long-term policy making. We commit to taking account of long-term objectives. We can reach our long-term objectives by introducing new practices for cooperation between Parliament and the government. The management of the government's policy objectives seek to coordinate the policy and resource processes, improve the efficiency of the coordination and implementation of government policy, and ensure policy preparation that extends across parliamentary terms. Research and foresight will be used more effectively to underpin the government's strategic policy making. Finland is a global leader when it comes to strategic foresight and policy making. This includes deliberations by Finland's Parliamentary Committee for the Future and regular futures reviews conducted across government ministries. We were happy to hear these remarks in the 50th anniversary symposium of Finland in the OECD by the Secretary General Angel Gurria. This remark was given in a context where he gave 3 reasons why Finland will have a growing global and multilateral relevance in the coming decades. Finland can play a bigger role than the size of the nation would suggest in finding solutions to humanity's common challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, the first futures dialogue between the government and the Parliament in the form of the government future report happened in 1993. In the midst of the recession, it was found to be good, and the government future report was later written into law. Once during each electoral period, the government submits to Parliament a report on the future focusing on long-term perspectives. The Committee for Future then prepares the Parliament's response to the government's report on future. This is a valuable strategic futures dialogue between government and the Parliament on major future problems and opportunities. Our government has also started the preparations for our government future report. We are looking forward to a process where co-creation, participation and collaboration are key to foster a dialogue about Finland for the next generations. We will also now start the process for the ministerial futures reviews to assess global trends and the development of the Finnish society and examine issues involving political decision-making. Generally, the aim of the ministerial future reviews is to generate public debate and provide information before elections and for the next government formation. The future belongs to all. For the purposes of the government decision-making, it is critical that the whole society is involved in making the future. The National Foresight Network aims to promote the use of information and future perspectives in decision-making. The purpose is to foster public discussion, research, and decisions on the new challenges and opportunities facing Finnish society. The network brings together friends of foresight and is a discussion and coordination forum for national foresight actors. Today's Foresight Friday is an example of this. A lot of work has been done to develop strategic decision-making with emphasis on research-based and foresight-based decision-making, and building a shared picture of the situation and the future in the whole of the government across ministries and decision-makers. We have to continuously find strategic responses, work across sectors, involve all levels of government, and watch for the capacities to implement and deliver to meet the challenges. Being in the middle of changes is not always easy, and we know that we will also face difficulties. We can succeed when we all take part in the transformation and in meeting the objectives. What I can assure you is that this government will focus on the future. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you will have an interesting discussions today around the main changes, and I hope during this day we can identify new insights regarding the interconnections of all these trends. We are looking forward to the next Global Trends report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. State Secretary. Now we have the pleasure to listen to the Deputy Director of Strategic Futures Group at the National Intelligence Council, being responsible for the preparation of the next Global Trends report. Please welcome Mrs. Erin Sikorsky.
Good morning. Thank you to Jaana and thank you to the Secretary for the warm welcome. I feel really privileged to be here to speak with all of you today and to learn from all of you today as we from the National Intelligence Council Strategic Futures Group prepare the next Global Trends report for a new or returning U.S. administration. As you may be aware, the Global Trends report has been published every 4 years in the United States since 1996. It is a framework for the future where we look 20 years out at key trends and uncertainties that we see shaping the national security environment for the United States. It is not policy prescriptive, so we don't talk about what we want the future to look like or what policymakers should do in response to that future. It's meant to be descriptive and help them think about the decisions they will have to make now and how that might shape outcomes in the future. The methodology for the report is both quantitative, so we commission a lot of external reports, so we have data underlying our assessments, but it's also qualitative. We subscribe to the science fiction author William Gibson, his quote that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And so we try to get out and travel quite a bit and visit many different parts of the world to have conversations like we're going to have today to understand how the trends that we've identified are playing out and how people are reacting to those trends around the world, whether it's governments, local civil society groups, or at the international level, at the multilateral level. So I really appreciate the help we're going to get in the conversation today, thinking about how the trends we've identified are going to intersect and shape future outcomes. So what I wanted to do with my few remarks here is two things. One is I wanted to talk about a project we did over the summer looking back at previous global trends reports to evaluate what we found and what we got right, what we missed, and then talk a little bit about where we're going to shape a bit of the conversations we'll be having in the breakout groups later this morning. So we looked back at the previous 6 reports over the summer, and what we found is that overall, we generally got the big trends pretty right. We called the growth of globalization and economic growth, the rise of terrorism as a threat pre-9/11, the role that climate change would play going forward, as well as the expansion of communications technology around the globe. We also described the rise of China and the rise of a competitive China going forward. What we missed, however, were discontinuities, of course, things that deviated from the trend, so-called black swan events. We also misinterpreted the implications of trends sometimes, where we got the underlying trends right, but again, how the people, how governments, or how individuals reacted to those trends, we missed. A key example of this is the Arab Spring or Arab Awakening in the Middle East. We had identified the trends, right? Demographic changes, rise in communications technologies, economic inequality, economic globalization issues, but we didn't identify how those trends would intersect to play out in the Middle East. Also, the rise of populism around the world. Again, it's something we identified, but not to the extent and not as quickly as we've seen it rise. And we also missed the resurgence of Russia and the more aggressive role it would play on the international stage. So as we approach the next report, keeping these lessons learned in mind and being humble in our approach to identifying trends for 2040, a couple things we tried to focus on. One is making sure we had a diverse group of people we were talking to in preparation for the report. So making sure to get out of the Beltway and out of the think tank world and talking to other international relations scholars, but making sure we're talking to scientists and civil society groups and people looking at these trends from different perspectives. Also, to distinguish really between what we identify as those key structural drivers and more emerging dynamics that could change or are more uncertain. So what I was going to do now is just walk you through the 4 structural drivers we've identified ahead of the next report. We're about a year out from delivering that report, and talk through those a bit, and then the breakout groups today will be looking at how these structural drivers may develop but also intersect with one another, because it's those intersections where you get the most interesting analysis. We see these drivers as fundamentals, less likely to change over the next 20 years, but they're not independent variables either. They impact one another. And I don't think any of them will be a surprise to this group, but I do want to talk about a little bit how we're thinking about them. So the first of the drivers is technology. And the first word that we think of when thinking of technology is pervasive. That everything people do will be digitally monitored and collected in the future, not because of the phone you have in your pocket, but because of the lens that's on your eye, or the chip that's under your skin, or the computer that's driving your car, or operating your refrigerator and your heating system at home. And it may be a state that's collecting all that information, as in the case of China, or it might be a private company or private companies that are collecting that information. And this tension between utility and security will continue to grow more intense and more important. You can either use the world and live in the world, or you can be secure and private. But doing those two things at the same time will become increasingly challenging. We'll also see a continuing paradox where you have the end of anonymity. Keeping secrets will be really, really hard in this world, but also potentially the end of truth. Be more and more difficult to know what is real, whether that's because of artificial intelligence enabling technologies like deep fakes or natural language processing. So you have a robot on a computer and it's really difficult to tell whether it's a robot or a human being interacting with you, or if it's just because of floods of information that are put out there by adversaries or bad actors trying to muddy the waters of truth and making it very hard for people to understand what is true and what is not. We also think of technology as being empowering, right? So that individuals, non-state actors, or even small states can act in ways that once only big states could. Because technology provides new tools, new information, and new access to other people that allows these smaller individuals and groups to act like states. A rural extremist in East Africa can go online and buy an off-the-shelf drone that can deliver a precision strike capability using GPS technology, right, in a way that that kind of individual never had access to that kind of technology before, and that really changes the game going forward. Also, we see technology as continuing to shock the economic system, whether it's through biotechnology, creating new manufacturing platforms, or additive manufacturing, changing supply chains, and the need for lots of employees in factories around the world. And a key question with technology, and frankly a question throughout all the trends, is who makes the rules going forward? As states tend to move quite slowly compared to private companies, and democracies tend to move slower in some of these areas than authoritarian governments, who's making the rules and setting the norms around these new technologies and how they're being used? A second structural driver we're focused on is climate change in the environment. And as I mentioned earlier, this has been in previous global trends reports, always as one of many challenges that governments will have to face. We assess going forward over the next 20 years, it will be the challenge that governments and the international community have to face. As there's a growing consensus that staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming is very difficult, if not impossible. The direct impacts of this warming planet, whether it's rising temperatures, rising sea levels, rising extreme weather patterns and changes in those weather patterns, will impact many places around the globe, but particularly will be felt in already poor countries that have poor resource and environmental management practices. So we see climate change exacerbating challenges these states are already facing. Whether it's food and water stress, the past couple of years have seen a decline in food security around the world, which is a reverse of a nearly decades-long trend. That's primarily because of conflict. When you add climate change pressures on top of that, the IPCC estimates a potential 84% rise in food prices over the next 20 years or so, potentially due to climate change. We also see an exacerbating impact around political instability as governments struggle to manage a whole variety of challenges, both in the developing world, but also potentially in middle and high-income countries, as governments struggle with the short-term versus long-term political imperatives they're facing. It's going to be really hard to convince populations to make changes in the short term that might seem very painful for some long-term gain around climate issues and could lead to greater political instability, and also migration pressures as temperatures rise and extreme weather events happen, natural disasters will change migration patterns and put more pressure on migration. We also see climate change opening new avenues of competition at the geopolitical level, whether that's in a warming Arctic or competition over new precious metals, natural resources that are needed in this world, and then also around setting the rules, again, the same theme, and setting norms over new technologies, things like geoengineering, things along those lines. The third bucket of structural drivers that we're looking at is demographic change, of course, one of the easiest trends in some ways to look at over the next 20 years. And here we're looking at three different issues primarily. One is age structures and unevenly distributed age structures around the world. You have an aging world, which we're here in Finland and much of Western Europe, as well as in East Asia and China and the United States, where you're going to have older and smaller populations than ever before, and what that challenge means for economic development in particular. Then you have a growing prime of life world. These are mostly low to middle income countries, Mexico, Brazil, India, Indonesia, where if they can grasp that demographic dividend of folks who are working age and looking for jobs, that could help push those countries into the middle class. And then you have the very young, very fast-growing world in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the Middle East, parts of Central America, again, places where climate change is going to be felt most acutely in the nearer term, and you're going to have large youth populations looking for jobs. If you can redistribute these populations over these three worlds, you could get to a potentially good place economically, but that creates a lot of political and cultural challenges as you think about those migration pressures and integration challenges. So this will be something to be managed going forward that will certainly shape the world over the next 20 years. Also, urbanization is a key piece of this, as well as the world becomes more urbanized. We have 33 megacities today that are 10 million people or over. This will be 43 by 2030. And although we see today China trying to lock down a city of 11 million people due to the coronavirus outbreak, we think that health issues will become even more acute in these megacities. You're not going to lock down Lagos or Dhaka. And what that means for economic development going forward will be something to monitor as well. The final structural driver that we're examining, and this was a key theme in our last report that came out in 2017, Paradox of Progress, but we think is still a key driving factor going forward, is the shifting power dynamics around the world. And this is both a change in the distribution of power, but also the nature of power, both between and within states. Of course, we have the shift going on from west to east in terms of economic power, potentially soft power in some ways, and the ability to shape norms and dynamics around technology in particular, and the role that China's playing there. But also, we have an increase in multipolarity around the world, especially within regions where more states are able to exert power in different ways. And we see that small states, non-state actors, and individuals can be powerful without having traditional means of power, particularly leveraging technology. And not only the tools themselves, but ideas about how to use the tools. And we saw this with Russia and their use of social media in particular and hybrid warfare. The ideas around how to leverage social media to put pressure on the West were really more important than the tools themselves. Those are cheap and easy to use. They tried lots of different things, but it was the ideas around them and figuring that out in many ways before the rest of us did, the power of that allowed them to exert that power. So those are the structural drivers, but what we're most interested in is how do these structural trends intersect to create emerging dynamics at three different levels: at the international system level, at the state and society level, and then at the individual level. And here we're looking at things at the international level, like the strain on institutions and alliances that these trends can lead to. At the state level, we're looking at challenges to democracy and the rise of authoritarianism. And at the individual level, we're looking at things like shifting identities and contestation around ideology. And I'm hoping that in the breakout groups today, some conversations can be had about how these trends are driving developments in these areas. The last thing I'll leave you with is some overarching themes that we see come out as we look at all of these trends. Yesterday, we met with the folks at the Citra Innovation Fund, and they used the words meta trends, and I like that because I think that's kind of what we're trying to get at with the themes here. One theme is speed, right? The time period for new technology adoption has shrunk significantly over the past 100 years, so the world is getting faster in many ways. As I said earlier, though, governments are often not getting faster at dealing with this sped-up world, and it's really disruptive as folks are trying to set new norms and new rules of the game in this fast world. Another theme is fragmentation, the potential for a deglobalized world and a highly personalized world where you can create a universe where you only interact with information and people who think like you and look like you. We anticipate many smaller, empowered groups in the world, which particularly for democracies makes governing a lot harder. It's a world, also another theme is inequality, as these trends play out differently around the globe, and the latest UNDP report showed that inequality globally has actually shrunk a bit, but inequality within states is growing. And I think we see that again playing out in the political arena around the world. Another theme, and for me this is one of the most important themes, is the idea of disequilibrium, that the old systems and ideas we had for managing the world no longer match the current challenges. And this is at every level, whether it's the international system level and the multilateral institutions aren't really matching the current challenges, but it's also at the local and individual level as things like climate and technology change people's everyday lives. I'm an East Africa expert by trade, and I think about the importance that the rainy season plays in places like Somalia and Kenya and Ethiopia, and how that rainy season is changing. And is there a rainy season anymore, and when does it happen? And how that shifts people's relationships to economic development, shifts people's relationships to their government. And as we're in this moment of disequilibrium, when the old systems don't match the new challenges, there's a lot of competition going on. That's our final theme, to set the new rules of the game, to identify the new systems and be the leader in those new systems going forward. And I think we expect over the next 20 years to see a more competitive world as this disequilibrium is fought over a bit. So I'll leave that there for now. I'm really looking forward to the breakout groups and then the discussion at the end. And again, thank you for this opportunity to be here and learn from all of you today as we move forward in the global trends process.
Thank you, Erin. I hope you don't mind me telling that Erin is actually 1/4 of a Finn. So she's very happy to be here, also due to her sort of personal links. So now we have the time to go to the breakout rooms. I would like to ask you to be back at 10:15. We have a rather tight schedule, and then we will be hearing the summaries of each groups. There were maps distributed where each of those themes are taking place. So as a summary, the digitalization is the only room or only group which is going downstairs. It's in the level 1 in the room 8. And then the other rooms are here. We have the rooms 14 and 21, the place where you had coffee. There you can have the discussions relating the geopolitics, and the demographics is just behind this room. But let's be back at 10:15. Enjoy the discussions. Thank you very much. to So let's wait, perhaps some people are still walking in. Okay, but I think we can start. I would like to ask for the chairs of each theme to deliver the key messages from the different breakout groups. And I wonder if Paula, yes, you are there. So if Paula Kivimaa, the research professor, climate change program from the Finnish Environment Institute, would tell the results of the climate change and environmental degradation group. Thank you.
Thank you. Always a challenge to summarize answers to 3 questions in 5 minutes, but I'll do my best. So the first question, did I actually have the question formulation? I don't know. It was about the security implications of climate change and environmental degradation. And we recognize that there are direct threats of climate change on people and communities, but there are also these sort of cascading risks which are perhaps more relevant to Finland and some other countries which are not facing the harshest direct effects. There are also like sort of 3 categories of security effects to civil society, for example, on health and food issues, on sort of national and international level issues of climate migration and security of supply in the changing conditions, both directly impacted by climate change, but also the changing landscape, and the geopolitics, the countries who are winners and losers and changing competition between countries. Also issues of the Arctic and the nuclear. And also the security risks might also arise from individuals being winners and losers in society. Okay, moving on to the next question on the economic impacts and opportunities. So we recognize that climate change creates unequal distribution of impacts, resources between countries, but also different countries have different adaptive capacities. And even when the resources or the potential economic benefits would arise to, for example, a developing country through the minerals and metals needed for renewable energy, who gains the profit? The profit might not actually go to those countries, but multinational companies. It was recognized that EU is doing good action relating to the economics, for example, through the Green Deal. The finance sector globally is shifting, is taking better account of the opportunities, but also risks of climate change. One specific thing is the Arctic opening, which is offering economic potential, but at the same time linking to environmental and security risks through the changing operation at the Arctic. And then finally, the discussion of how well the carbon pricing is ultimately an important underlying factor. And finally, the third question was about really how to galvanize, or what are the prospects for non-government capital to galvanize the green economy. Our group really particularly discussed sort of consumer pricing and how really the internalizing the environmental cost to consumer pricing would then make the private sector funding more targeted. We talked a bit about new business models where new types of green finance can play a role and are needed, but also the difficulties to invest green. So even for green investors and also for consumers interested in green investments, there might not at the moment be enough places to invest, but also the lack of information because the label green is sometimes used rather haphazardly, and the lack of information for the investors on what are the actual viable sources. And here underlying element of how people, to make this sort of truth populism issue was brought up, that whether people actually believe in climate change will also have impacts onto this mobilization of the private finance. That's a very quick summary.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to ask Tuomas Martikainen, Director from the Migration Institute of Finland, on the results of the Demographic Change and Migration Group.
Good morning. So we were asked 3 questions. The first question to be addressed was what are the implications of aging, shrinking populations. And the thing is that what we started with is that these effects are unevenly distributed, even in Finland. So there's big regional differences in this issue. And there are people for whom this change is beneficial and others who are not doing well with the current changes. As a side comment to that, something that was taken up in several of our discussions was about both the possibilities that the use of social media, either in policy processes, I will return to that later, or then for elderly people, how well they are able to use them. Taking as an example of contemporary times, how can people book train tickets if they don't understand how the contemporary national rail system apps work? Then we discussed quite a bit about different ethical and social impacts of this aging population, including, for example, maybe a renewed interest in the discussions of euthanasia, for example, and a significant issue related to sort of diversifying population is that what is a family combined with migration, how it impacts family structures, people's relationships to their relatives, and so on. So family structures may be in change. Second question was about the future of urbanization and country internal as well as migration as well as international migration. It was a consensus in our group that the role of the cities will grow vis-à-vis the state, maybe, because cities are those places that draw most of the incoming people and especially younger people. This has an impact then for the other regions where availability of workers might be at risk. Workers don't want to move to regions that are not so well developing or financially as economically as active as others. So in order to ensure that this transition goes smoothly, it needs to be tackled with political and other type of programs to provide support for the companies and also those people who are there. Some discussion was about the role of immigration. Currently, there is a view that labor migration is needed to ensure the availability of workforce in Finland, and this also needs then some support. As the rising number of immigrants, as it's already today, but maybe even so more in the future, it needs a social acceptance. It changes in one way or another the realities of everyday life. So it needs to be, there needs to be dialogues and discussions on various levels of society in order to make this change both acceptable and in its various implications as potentially good as it can be. And we have to remember that this is part of a larger, broader changes, including changes in what is work in tomorrow's world. So migration is only one aspect of these. Now, the last question was that how will these trends shape governance? Well, cities becoming more important. We might see in Finnish politics a growing tension even we see it already now, but maybe increasing in the future between the growth economic city regions and the others. Okay, how does that affect the system? Second was more about more concrete, down-to-earth governance models or administrative models, how to tackle with this change. So maybe we are more in an event-based world, either in the real life that issues are more complex, or in the way how they are mediatized. We see the rise of various kind of phenomena very quickly that more let's say, stagnatized governance systems have more difficulty in dealing with. And then I will conclude with this. How will that affect the world of politics? How will political parties respond to this? And that is something we shall see. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I would like to welcome Maria Rautavirta. She is the Director of Unit at the Ministry of Transport and Communications on the results of the digitization of everything, data as power and technology group. Welcome.
Yes, hello for everyone. I think my group was having a challenging topic to cover all the technological trends in 30 minutes, but I think the basis of the work we have done here in Finland for our futures report already has given us a certain big picture on what is happening in the world. So our questions were the implications of hyperconnectivity for societies and individuals, and then the digitization of everything, and the kind of the data-driven economy and how that affect the distribution of power. So as we see, everything will be connected and everything will be automated, that can be, and the world will be data-driven. And we would like to distinguish that data is not about facts, it's all kinds of data. And we see that during the next years we will have to put more emphasis on the integrity, the authenticity and trust that is built with the economical models, the power structures and the governance models, because there is going to be discontinuity. We may be seeing the death of the open internet, and we see that there's a kind of different tribes emerging. They can be global, they can be local, but different kinds of values will be shaping peoples and individuals and states that have a similar mindset. We have been also dividing that there is the US, the Asia, the European approach that is more value-based, created to kind of support and to protect the individuals. We will see also identities or different kind of identities and management models. So also as a counterforce with this kind of a company-owned data structures that are now leading the value chains and the global competition. So there will be maybe we will see more fragmentation. Even we would like to be seeing more interoperability and data sharing and so on. But the models or the future is driven with technologies. So it's we can follow the Gartner kind of approach, but we see also that there is a constant need for stabilizing the future for the individuals, and it's hard to say which camp is winning. But anyway, we see that the technologies, the hyperconnectivity will be in an individual level, state level, society level, and the global level. Even plants will be digitized and connected, and that is of course a huge opportunity how we can mitigate the climate change and use it as a tool to find new solutions for different challenges. But it's also that we have to build the trust, build trust networks, build mechanisms how we validate, authenticate information that is distributed. And we discussed about the example in how you are doing research, that you have a group of validators checking your results. Is this kind of a professions coming as a common profession to check the kind of the content we are distributing in the internet? And also energy consumption of the ICT sector and the data-driven economy will be a kind of a challenge to tackle. Then we saw some marks on the rise of the standardization. Even things like ethics will be standardized. We will see mechanisms to tackle these issues, but it is kind of inevitable that not everybody gets to the industrial revolution at the 4.0 level. There will be companies on the 1.0 level, and the kind of the tension between companies and even states can remain high. So the platform economy is rising, but it's also a question mark. Is the kind of a model still the valid model for people being connected in the next era? So it's much based on the trust and how these value chains will be developed. Global value chains, new organizing kind of the resources, and maybe some black swans as well then. Yes, I think this was most that we covered, so we will see how the future will show up, but we are prepared.
Thank you, Maria. Now I'd like to welcome Mika Aaltola, Director from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, on the results of the diffusion of power within and between states.
Good morning to everybody. I'm here to deliver the results from the diffusion of power group, which is a very diverse phenomenon, and I liked in the keynote address the word paradoxes of things. So you have counter-cyclical and cyclical trends interacting, causing intended and unintended consequences and cascading effects that need to be taken into consideration. So how things translate into politics of it. After all, we are political animals, and that is the kind of the main sphere through which we understand the narratives of what is happening around us. So we focused on geopolitics. There are different trends there. One clearly is the rise of identity politics, and that is counter-cyclical in the sense that the expectation was that states are normalizing, liberalizing, interdependency takes over, and the centralized unitary states as actors are gradually disappearing. But we have seen the resurgence of the centralized unitary actors, at least when it comes to global geopolitics. But of course, one reason, one key driver or trigger for that is people's search for identities and identity security, in the sense of having clear, simplistic stories to tell about why they are feeling they like the way they are. So this is something that needs to be understood more clearly, the dynamics of identity and how that interacts with non-state actors like digitalized algorithmic platforms. So how that influences the factions within the states, and how that produces sense of contestations and search for identities that seem to be real and true and meaningful. There are quite a lot of different things that the groups went over. For example, how geography interacts with these transnational processes. Already in the previous group, the word value chains was mentioned, and I think it is important to understand that value chains and the global flows and being part of the transnational entities perhaps doesn't give you the rootedness that you would like to feel, and therefore nation states, nativist solutions are returning because they can deliver something that is perhaps missing. And it is important trend and might continue also in the future. And that also means weakening of democracies and the rise of autocratic solutions. So there are regressive tendencies instead of progressive visions. We often in discussions like this, we focus on the change that is to come and we give that progressive name. Of course, it is a complex future that we are going to meet. But the simplistic political understandings and narratives are going to emerge from those complexities and uncertainties of the future. And so that's one of the paradoxes I think is key in order to understand these things. So geography, so how things translate, kind of the global hierarchy, the hubs and spokes, or the super hubs, sub-hubs, and spokes of global flows translate into the actual geographical map. And that's a complicating factor. And it, of course, creates certain pressures, especially when it comes to shared political spaces like maritime regions. The group pointed out the importance of interaction between climate change and geography and Arctic region when it comes kind of the middle ocean is very important as a geopolitical arena if it comes free of sea ice in a couple of decades as it is currently prognosticated. So what are the ramifications of that? And remember that it doesn't happen in vacuum. You know, the world where the sea ice in the Arctic has disappeared is a very different world from the world where the sea ice exists. So the cascading effects, so it's not only linear processes that are regional taking place, but there are global feedback loops that are very important to understand. One discussion took over the issue of Russia-China relations, and especially in Finland it's important to realize that China shouldn't be seen through the lens of Russia. So China has its own strategic culture, and the way in which they think differs from Russia. So the natural solidarity between autocracies shouldn't be taken as granted. So what will evolve from that? The clashing points are the shared spaces, Central Asia, Arctic, different corners in the Pacific that are important for the future of this relationship. And Russia finds itself in a different situation than China. China can take it easy. It's not a spoiler of the rule-based order. It actually benefits quite a lot from that, whereas Russia sees its future in perhaps meddling and interfering and kind of a sharp tactical moves. But of course those moves have to be limited in the sense that Russia doesn't have resources and China needs resources. So there's bound to be tensions in the relationship. But how the Russia-West relations are going to develop is one answer is that it is a function of the Russia-China relations, and currently Russia is also benefiting from having so many major power constellations approaching it because it is a vital source of resources. Last group discussed the diffusion of power and the return of geopolitics. Again, I started with that, and it's good to conclude with that. So how does geopolitics occur in the modern time, contemporary times? It's not going to be a return to a Cold War relations. So the geopolitics takes more increasingly the competitive energies are focused on the functional domains rather than geographical domains. So those functions that people's daily global lives are dependent on, those transnational functions, are increasingly being seen as zero-sum games. So who controls the access, who controls the flows in the financial, digital, and different other senses. That's going to be the places of contestation, and that's going to be throwing, of course, smaller states, mid-sized states into the equation as well, because they are heavily dependent on these ecosystems that are built around major powers and uniquely around US as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Mika. Now I'd like to welcome Heikki Hiilamo, Professor of Social Policy, University of Helsinki, on the results of the Globalization and Economic Inequalities Group.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I had the honor to chair a group which was focusing on globalization and economic inequality. And I was also fortunate to have two excellent co-chairs, Pasi Moisio and Anne Stenroos. We split the group into two, one for focusing on economic inequality, one focusing on globalization. And we had a collection of some excellent minds, so it is my very difficult task to convey their ideas and try to summarize their thoughts. I'll start with the future of globalization. We were discussing where is globalization headed, and is the world on a path to deglobalization, and what does that mean or look like? And summarizing the discussion, I can identify 5 different points. First, we discussed that what we're experiencing is a kind of a globalization 4.0, which is characterized by the fact that there is a free movement of services. This is not something which is happening everywhere, and globalization 1, 2, 3, and 4, they are all in different stages in different regions. But it's important to realize the fact that free movement of services is really dominating the future of globalization. Secondly, we discussed this topic, which was brought up eloquently by Erin Sikorsky, of 3 different levels: systemic level, national level, and individual level, and effect of globalization on those 3 different levels. And we were able to identify also a 4th level, which we think is important to identify. It's somewhere between national level and individual level, which is kind of a local level of organization and companies. And it's important to look at globalization or deglobalization from that perspective as well. Thirdly, we discussed the role of unpredictable developments in globalization, especially the role of social movements. And we just took Greta Thunberg as one example of just a single person who started the Fridays for Climate movement, which has spread into a global movement, and this one single individual has made a big impact on the way how we perceive climate change. So there can be kind of a local pockets of disruptions. We can also think about this in terms of our first point, the free movement of services, whether the workers who are currently engaged in a very low pay service jobs, whether they also want to rebel against their work conditions and launch a kind of a bigger movement and cause disruption in globalization. The 4th point is something about middle classes. We discussed middle classes also in relation to inequality, but we thought that it's important to think if the middle classes are benefiting or if they actually perceive that they are benefiting from globalization. It seems that that's not the case in the US, but it's very much so in the Asian countries, where the middle classes is actually increasing. Finally, the fifth point was that globalization hasn't actually changed the fundamentals in international development with regard to conflict between raw materials and resources. So this kind of a power struggle still exists, and it's shaping globalization. Then turning to economic inequality, we made three major points. First one is quite obvious, that the current economic system is very much favoring accumulation of wealth. And we're going to see a lot more billionaires in the future. I think you've probably seen a list of cities in the world with the number of billionaires, and you see that it's dominated by Chinese cities, and that could be also a future trend. And it's shaping the way inequality is perceived in the world. Second point touched upon stratification, which is a key concept in my discipline, and that's about how we can categorize people's position in society. And we thought that stratification in the globalized post-material world is very much different from the way it was in, let's say, feudalist or industrial society. It's much more unpredictable, and the rules of social stratification process are changing and this process is becoming more fluid, more vague, and it seems that on the top of the distribution we see, as I just said, more billionaires. In the middle we see kind of a confusion and resentment, which is connected to the rise of populism, for example. And at the bottom we see exclusion. People are no longer being able to make their end meets and to get a paid employment and reach any kind of valued position in the society. Thirdly, we thought about what Finland could perhaps teach for the US and perhaps for other countries in terms of inequality and in terms of social stratification in a new globalized world. It's much more difficult to predict one's position in a society, and things can change for individuals very rapidly. But our experience is that education is still the key for securing well-being and good position in the society, and it's also benefiting not just the individual but the whole society. So I think we are very proud of our free education system, and we very much embrace those initiatives in the US of improving access to education. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all the chairs. Now I would like to ask everybody, all the chairs, to join us on the stage. And actually just Erin will be here at the closest here to the speaker's podium. I'll be on the other side, and if you can just take a seat somewhere in between. Erin, now you have been listening to all these summaries from the different groups. I would really love to hear your reflections and your thoughts on what you have just heard.
Thank you, and thanks to all the chairs. Unfortunately, technology isn't advanced enough that I was able to be in all the rooms at the same time and listen to the discussions, but it sounds like you had really rich conversations. You know, listening to you report back, there were a few themes that stood out to me across all of the discussions. The first was the importance and relevance of value systems, and both that the new trends as they develop are impacting value systems and then potentially creating new value systems as well around these ideas of what is work, what is family, how does trust relate, and how do we continue to shape and build trust in this new environment with technology in particular. And I really like this idea about people creating stories about who they are in this world and the potential for kind of this regressive reaction with value systems and the tensions there. So I think being attuned as we look at this report, not only to what the physical developments are in the world, but it's really more the reactions of the values and the social changes that these trends will develop. That's perhaps most important in understanding how the future will play out. Another theme that I thought was really interesting, and it's one that we've talked about in previous global trends reports, is the number of players who can impact the system going forward, whether it's multinationals, whether it's cities or individuals, as someone mentioned with Greta. But then again, this reaction, right? The strengthening of nation states in response to the challenge of managing all the players in the game and the regressive tendencies, as was mentioned, of nation states striking back in many cases to push back against all the players. And I think that tension, again, going forward, it's uncertain how that will develop, but will really shape the landscape. A third theme that I heard was this idea of uneven distribution, right? And I'm wondering if we need to be even more precise in our analysis around how things are being distributed around the world, both between and within states. This idea that even within the business world and companies, there will be unequal adoption of new technologies and the globalization 4.0, but it's not everywhere, right? Some are still stuck in the globalization 1.0, and so understanding those dynamics. And then the last theme for me that really struck me was this idea, again, of paradox, particularly regarding geography, and how in some cases geography will matter more than ever, particularly when you think about climate change and sea level rise. I mean, the geography is very, very critical to understanding how that will all play out. But then as technology and mobility really erase borders, and this idea that geopolitical competition isn't happening in a geographic way necessarily, it's focused on these functional domains. And so how do we navigate a world in which, in some cases, geography is critical, and in other cases, it's not the main focus? I think will be challenging because we're very much, particularly in the geopolitical realm, our systems and ideas about thinking about the world are very much rooted in geography, and how do we push ourselves beyond those bounds, particularly when you have this strengthening moment of the nation state in many ways, and folks who want that geography to still be very important. So those were some of the key ideas that stood out for me, and I think just overall as well, the interconnectedness among these different issues. You can't talk about one without talking about the others, in both potentially positive ways and negative.
Thank you, Erin. I will be making a small question round on all the chairs, and after that I will be handing over to Erin, because this is the preparation for the Global Trends report, and she and her team are here to learn insights. So just wanted to also offer her the opportunity to ask questions to you, and because she will be the one needing the results and the insights. But Tuomas, we have rather large groups of minorities that have been established in many countries where people's roots, they are somewhere else. They were born somewhere else than where they live. And what kind of implications will this have in the future?
Now, if I think from the perspective of people who are already, in a different place where they grew up, so what we have seen over the past decades has been an increasing attention by states to engage with their own diasporas. Many of you remember the presidential election in Turkey, where Turkey was apparently doing all kinds of things that it aimed to benefit its own cause among the diaspora populations in Europe, for example. So this is probably something that we might see continuing elsewhere. Increasing number of states during the past 2 decades have created specific diaspora policies. Okay. Now, again, if these are considered problematic, then they might provide counter-reactions. We have seen, again, an increasing rise in the availability of dual citizenship, which, for example, Russia, as part of its compatriot policies, is, let's say, making it visible in one way or another. So it's these kind of dynamics when we have people with at least rather recent roots in the sending country that will play in many ways. Another aspect that I would like to take up, Saskia Sassen, a well-known geographer of global cities, just brought up a few years ago the idea that whereas in the global system we are looking at international migration through 2 basic mechanisms, as migrants, where we have the Global Compact for Migration, and as refugees, where we have the Global Compact for Refugees that many countries have supported. Well, she pointed out that there's an increasing number of people who are, what we might call those without papers or whatever, kind of like an undefined category. So what will be the role of this? It's unsure, but this relates to the technological advancements that were taken up here as well. So it's obvious that policing has moved away from the borders. I mean, we still have international borders and maybe borders between different regions in different countries, but with help of electronic surveillance, it might be that we will have borders everywhere. You walk on the street anywhere, you are subject to policing in one way or another. What we see very much discussed in China, for example, currently.
Thank you. Just one, you mentioned Russia. Now, Putin announced proposals for a new law, saying that, he actually said that he proposed a constitutional amendment stipulating that any future president needs to have lived in Russia for 25 years without a break and have never had a foreign passport or residency permit. May I still ask you, what does this tell you?
Fear.
Thank you. Maria, going into the technologies, there is a lot of discussion about the need for new kinds of rules that we should be defining, the ethics and these kind of foundations moving forward. But do we need new rules for the new technologies?
Yes, I think the answer is yes, and I see that the platform economy was kind of an awakening call for instance, for Europe, and the first measures how to regulate it were like they were planned against some negative impacts that were caused by this. But now we are getting back to the game, to focus on the economic growth and the potential of data economy and the digitally connected world. And we see that there has been a lot of discussion in Europe on data sovereignty and how we will be able to build human-centric, thriving and balanced data economy, regulation and governance. And during our presidency, we prepared principles for data economy for Europe, which emphasize the need to put human centricity, the individuals in the center. And we also see from the technological point that the individuals are the only ones that have access to all their data kind of sources. They can combine the data from Facebook, Google, Amazon, and their other applications, and they are the only one that can see the whole picture. And I think the storytelling and how the individuals are built on top of their data, I think that we'll see that the human rights, the fundamental rights will be put back in the center of the discussions on the new regulative model, at least in the Europe. But we will see how we manage to do that, but the drive is high.
Mentioning the human rights, I think that's sort of the question, how to analyze these new technologies through the lenses of these established sort of rights that we have. Could you elaborate on your thoughts about this?
Yes, I earlier thought or said that so far, or even in the future, the development will be technology-driven. But along that, we acknowledge that those that develop technologies are not those that are putting them into the societal context or thinking about the ethics. And with the AI, we saw the rise of discussion on the ethical aspects of machine-made decisions. And now we are at the phase in the discussions where we see that, hey, we have already set the rules. They are in the human rights, the fundamental rights. Now we have to interpret these rights into new technologies, because this is not the only technology that will come. We will have to, with every new invention, we will have to think, how does this affect the fundamental rights, the human rights, and how we make the transparency on AIs, on algorithms such that humans can still have a control over the results that the technologies are providing. I think now we are getting to the point and starting to see kind of a real discussion on how this will be done.
Thank you. Paula, could you elaborate in which ways security is relevant for the global energy transition and climate change?
Okay, thanks. I suppose it connects also with the other group that discussed geopolitics. So we all know by now that urgent action on climate change is needed, and and energy, of course, is only one of the factors, but still, energy production causes most of the carbon dioxide emissions, and geopolitical considerations are one of the things that has really slowed down this sort of low carbon energy transitions, particularly, of course, in countries which have significant fossil fuel reserves, such as Poland and Germany, and especially Eastern Europe, Russia relationship, and Eastern European countries want to maintain a degree of energy independence, but also elsewhere. So, for example, in Finland, coal was for a long time seen as an important balancing fuel in the mix. So I think the rate at which we'll be able to globally adopt renewable energy efficiency, and smart demand response is likely to be important for the geopolitics, because it kind of changes when these become more common, it changes the power positions between the states that have traditionally been in a powerful position because of their fossil fuel reserves. There's, of course, this new, for the renewable energy and the smart grid technologies, we need new metals and minerals, and this is kind of we're changing from fuel security to mineral security and acquisition, and it's not only, I suppose, between the states, but also the multinational companies come into play. And overall, I think the energy transition is influencing or causing a changing security landscape, whether it will happen in the 20 years that your time perspective is, or for a longer time. But obviously we have the cybersecurity issues with the increasing digitalization of the energy systems and the smart grids. But we also have the other side of the polarization of climate debate that we're seeing globally, but also in Finland, the rise of populism, but also and this sort of contestation and conflicts between the groups that want to do something for the climate change and others that are sort of opposing this whole idea. And of course, then we have the questions of migration. And I think underlying this all is this idea of what has come up in the other group discussions, which I think are relevant, is the changing role of states in general, the increasing role of cities, and perhaps also this rise of smaller states, so the independence that's coming, like wishes from Scotland or Catalonia, and how these then also link to the ownership of the energy resources.
Thank you. Talking about, you mentioned the cyberspace. Now I'd like to go to Mika and ask, now in the future, what is the meaning of sovereignty in cyberspace? We are also entering sort of the space race, or we are already in the space race. And what is the space sovereignty, or the state sovereignty in space?
Very fascinating questions. How cyberspace influences kind of distribution or diffusion of power. Well, there used to be quite a lot of argumentation that cyber power actually is a new factor, a new driver, even it could be a revolutionary driver. But if you look to the map and what actually has resulted is the replication of old power patterns into the map of cyberspace. So, for example, undersea data cables where 99.9% of your data flows. It doesn't flow in the air, it flows ultimately in the sea cables. If you look to the global map of those, you can see how US-centric that map is. If you check then the content of those data flows, for example, in one of the key domains of finance, the similar pattern occurs there. So the financial flows and the capitalization flows in the global markets, they closely resemble the map of data cables. So, old patterns of power are replicated into new domains, and therefore those new domains become also sources of contestation, and there is, of course, potentials in the cyberspace for asymmetrical situations. We have all witnessed how cleverly, for example, this quickening tempo in Russia when it comes to how it sees its position in the future, perhaps lowering position, has resulted in very innovative techniques of, for example, election meddling. That's something that was thought to be very unlikely, but it has happened in several elections in US, in Brexit, in German elections. So new patterns, new vulnerabilities emerge that perhaps exist in the same time when the old power patterns are replicated into new domains, and this is a fascinating competition. You also mentioned space and that comes. What it brings to my mind is, of course, the new space and the lowering of the price of putting satellites, different new types of satellites, into the orbit. Well, space is as far from us than Tallinn is from us. So it's about 100 kilometers. So it's very close by. And then the inter-domain is very important to realize in here. 5G is the first technology that actually points upwards. So it connects with air traffic, which is one domain that has very high value added, and with space. So with 5G, you have a kind of a standard power. For the first time, a major Chinese close-to-state company, Huawei, was part of the package of standards that went into 5G. And that is important to understand that China is now in the kind of the key critical infrastructure. It's a player there, and that is the Chinese way of doing things. So no clever, fast tempo moves when it comes to meddling in with different democracies and lowering their status and internal cohesion. but kind of taking time and participating in the standard creation, of course also through methods of industrial espionage, but clearly you can see also the geopolitics of both cyberspace and space that is emerging and becoming based on the ecosystems around China, around US, increasingly its competitive space. And with, about Russia, I should still mention that it is in some ways very hyper-modern society. We like to usually think that somehow Russia is a declining, and in many ways demographic way is one key point where Russia has weaknesses. It's running out of some of the natural resources. It's facing the gravitational pull of China with most of the natural resources of Russia being in Siberia. But the hypermodern side of Russia is that it has created an alternative financial system. It can transfer capital very easily to places where it is in a safe place. So Russia has a world record when it comes to money, Russian national health being located outside of the country. So it is in places like New York, Paris, Frankfurt, so it is in places where the money is actually safe. So that is one alternative system that Russia has created, and I think we should not discount that as a reason for Russian strength also in the future, one key driver for Russia, and also one key driver why Russia needs to be present in democracies. It needs to have influence. So the Russian sphere of influence is no longer limited to any Ruski Mir type of definition of it. It is very global, and it's very, very Western. So where money makes money, Russia is present, and it has interests.
It would be interesting to elaborate on all of your answers. Unfortunately, the time will not allow too much of that. I'd like to go to Heikki and actually bring it a little bit more home, back to Finland. And Finland is on top of the league on many different comparisons, and at the same time, we are talking a lot about well-being, and there are the happiness reports or the happiness sort of rankings, and we are the happiest nation in the world. So what do you see is the sort of the reasons or sort of the reason behind this?
Well, this is a kind of a tricky question, this being the happiest nation in the world, because, in Finland it's kind of, it goes like a joke that if something is really bad, then we say that, well, we are the happiest nation, and then the others say, give me a break. But it's something to do with the nature of our welfare state. I think we're one of the most developed welfare states, and we're on top of the league in almost all comparisons of well-being, which means that the domestic debates are quite difficult because, if you're already among the very best, there isn't that much room to improve. If you're a tennis player who has won all the games over the last 2 years, the future is not going to look perhaps so promising. And that's why this debate is kind of twisted in Finland. But when we talk to people outside of Finland, then we mostly point to the question of trust. And the trust which has been created over a very long period of time. And this Nordic welfare state model, it's kind of a happy marriage. Originally, it was a happy marriage between the church and the state. And there was no tension between because the king was the head of the state and also the head of the church. And people who wanted to pay respect to their church and to the state, they could turn into the same institution. And we still have these remnants of the state church tradition, which are quite difficult to communicate to people outside Finland, especially to people from the US, that, for example, the parliament is opened through worship at this big white church over there. And the church law is passed in the parliament. Of course, it can be changed, but it can be rejected. It hasn't ever happened, but it's possible. So there is this very long tradition going back centuries, and this trust was created little by little, and now what we see is that this trust is somehow eroding. Since Erin talked about the role of nation state and somehow getting the state back in, but it seems that the progressive, mostly the social democrats, the left-wing politicians, they were keen on developing the state, the welfare state. But now it seems that it's the conservatives, the populists, who are interested in the state, but from a very different angle and with a very different policies. So there is a big tension, and I think people are following up on the Nordic countries, perhaps not with the same kind of expectations as before, because we have a lot of more problems than we used to have.
Now I'd actually like to hand over to Erin and give you the time. You have made the long way to visit us, and knowing that this is all flowing into preparing the next Global Trends report. And you come here because you have some questions you want to ask, and you want to create some new insights, perhaps, like what can Finland offer. So for the next 25 minutes, the floor is yours, and I'd like to give you the space for asking our panel the questions you need to ask.
Sure. Thank you very much, and those questions you had were excellent. I'm frantically scribbling notes here to make sure I can remember it all. One question I wanted to ask, in my opening remarks, I talked about this idea of power shifts and how we've identified not only the distribution of power, but the nature of power is changing. I think we're still having debates within our team, though, as we look at what are the elements of power going forward. If we look out 20 years, how will we define power in the future? And I wanted to ask each of you, from your perspectives on the topics you're covering, what do you think the elements of power going forward are? What are the most important things that will define power in our future world?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. Usually power is defined in terms of actor A being influenced actor B in ways that are not in the best interest of actor B. So kind of a coercive power, there are different methods for that. Then there's the institutional power, everybody becoming interdependent, and then it becomes more of a power of influencing, setting kind of the common rules and shared norms. And then you have structural power, that influences things from outside, technology, information technological revolution, climate change, and then of course the emergence of global markets in the sense of globalization, markets being dislocated from the production. And then you have cognitive power, the power of telling the stories and the narratives that are in the heart of the identity politics, kind of a discursive power, being able to formulate something in an appealing way. So where, in the present situation, where the power is based, it's increasingly kind of a cognitive, social media-driven cognitive debates, and then algorithmic side of that influences, so it has an element of structural power, and it has also element of coercive power, because you can through transnational and state-based actors influence the cognitive flows of people, how they are developing their mindset, for example, towards voting in a particular way. So the power composition has changed a bit, and it's more based on different platforms than before. Perhaps a little bit less on the multilateral institutional side of things, and a little bit more on the kind of the fast tempos of coercive, structural, and cognitive power based on digital media platforms, influenced by algorithmic market-driven behavior. So kind of understanding of that would be very important when you think about global competition. But I would still, being an active student of great power politics, see that coercive kind of the world order type of power, who can influence that, the kind of the unitary major states that can actually do things. So globalization wasn't a spontaneous market-driven process. It was also based on kind of a Nixonian turn in 1970s, where the power balance in the Eurasia needed to be shifted by US forming semi-alliance with China. So that favored the rise of production in East Asia, and the dislocation of markets from production sites that now has political ramifications, because that production needs to be brought in different countries back, because it gives more rooted sense of what people are actually doing. But you shouldn't forget that it is political, and political shapes of power at global scale form the embeddings and the context of then other types of activities. So I would say that is the main structural power, how that shape is forming, and what is the directionality of that constellation currently, and that then determines quite a lot of other things. But this is my very biased view. I'm very Aristotelian in the sense that we are political animals, and so when we say that future is about technological change, I'm always a little bit skeptical.
Well, I'm looking at flesh and blood, moving bodies like us that breathe. So it's not by chance why people move or who move. There are some regularities in it. But if I'm trying to look into the future, so it seems to me, to some extent, as a digital battlefield. It's about the surveillance control technologies on the one hand, and then the endless imagination of the human as individuals or members of some groups to find the wormholes or their own way through this system. So perhaps the question is that if we go towards an extremely pervasive digital surveillance of individuals, then I think the individual agency is maybe much more restricted than today. If it goes the other way, then it might be a democratization of opportunities in this sense for those who are willing to take the opportunity. I don't see any clear outcome for this question.
I just wanted to make it sort of more concrete and to the context of energy transitions and what the technological development has done or has created the opportunity to empower consumers and communities to act as energy producers. And this is kind of a point that there's an increase in discussion on energy democracy. So this trend is about moving the power of ownership of energy production from utilities and large companies to these smaller communities. Of course, there are barriers to it, so it depends on which country you're in. And for example, Finland has worked on removing the legislative barriers that consumers can actually do this. So I think this is like one concrete example how the global energy transition could lead to more dispersed ownership and therefore more dispersed power in this context. The other point is about cities and how cities are becoming increasingly more important and of course we've got the globally the large cities, but also in the climate action, there are cities that are leading and going beyond the national or the state requirements, but then there are also other cities that are not, and they're sort of maybe lagging behind and they're following. And I think this whole dynamics with cities is going to be very interesting in terms of the question of power as well, and whether we could even, and of course historically states have been the actor in power, whether we could even in the long-term future see a different kind of a world where cities are the main actors, but that's more of a question. One point I think is really important when we are talking about power and the fact that we are experiencing transition in all these issues, but we also need the transition to a more environmentally sustainable world, that we really should strive to achieve just transitions. And this really means that those who are not in power, those who don't have the power, are considered. So following the sustainable development goals and really considering the implications of the transitions to more marginal groups and different actors and how we can compensate them. And in the energy context, there's an increasing discussion about energy justice.
Well, from a technological perspective, I think we have seen the kind of the monopolistic structures in economic power already, and I think now we are going from the fragmented, monopolistic to decentralized, so the win-win situation has been acknowledged, and with the economical power and the more even distribution of the economical benefit, I think we will see that there will be less of those kind of structures that are emphasizing or amplifying the monopolistic effects. So we are at the peak of monopolies in some sense. With the money, of course, then moves the power in geopolitics or regions, but also because there is no barriers for digital and data-driven economies, the state and the businesses, they don't follow the same kind of rules, but we will maybe see fragmentation in the regulative framework. But on the power itself, I think it is a possibility, and it's also a threat, that the power is shared as evenly as the digitalization and the capabilities to be connected are distributed. So in Finland we are in good position. 99% of people are completely connected in mobile. So everybody has the ability to be connected and be part of the democratic new structures of information and how social media and the tribes are kind of emerging. But I think this is also that if you want to build also some other kind of state, you can control it by giving connectivity to only a few. So this is a new tool for those that maybe are not so willing to put emphasis on the democratic aspects. But economical power, most certainly it will be more distributed. But it's also that it's the data is not a consumable resource. So you can, with the same data, you can do new value. So it's not like oil that is once pumped and then burned, but the data can be used in the company context, in societal context, and then it can be used for research and innovation. So even with the small amount of data, you can get a lot of economical new business opportunities. So that will shift kind of the logic of economies.
Well, money is power and power is money, right? But I guess the crucial issue is how money is used to wield power. We discussed the question of billionaires, and I think people perceive billionaires very differently depending on how they've created their wealth, whether they are IT entrepreneurs who started off from a garage and then ended up having a very big company and wanted to keep the money inside the company, or in some case, if they got some dividends, they invested it in for charities, or whether they are people who are using the money to influence politics and pursue their own ideas. I'm not going to give you any examples. I'm sure you can think of some persons, or if you're somebody who has hidden your wealth in some tax havens, etc. And even on a broader scale, I think what's important is how the investment capital is directed, whether it's invested in places where people are already quite affluent, like in Europe, or in traditional investment targets, or whether you're going to invest the money into places where there are certainly needs for people to fulfill their basic needs, like infrastructure investments or environmental investments in sub-Saharan Africa. And what's quite kind of interesting is that there are huge investment capitals all over, but it seems that it's only China which is interested in making those very essential investments in sub-Saharan Africa. They're financing airports, they're constructing roads, they're establishing universities. And of course, that kind of funding always comes with strings. It's somehow wielding the power of money in that sense that I'm kind of concerned that this development is not discussed so much.
Just jumping here because it's just too interesting of an opportunity. Erin, now you heard these, what is shaping the power. In addition to what has been said, from your point of view, what is shaping the power?
It's a good question. Frankly, I think much of what we've been talking about as we shape this report has been discussed here. I think it's I go back to this question of states and cities especially, and we talked a lot in the last report we wrote, Paradox of Progress, about the rise of local solutions and local innovation, right? And that's where innovation's happening at the local level and in cities. But yet I think there are still some issues where the power of the state is increasingly seen as necessary, right, to manage the world that we're in. And so I wonder if you see a more fragmented version of power in some ways, in that power is exerted on specific issues in specific ways, right? Cities might be able to organize around some challenges, but not all challenges, right? And you see, we've been using the term minilateral as opposed to multilateral as a way of seeing the international system organized to take on challenges now as groups of like-minded entities, whether they are states or cities or corporations, NGOs coming together to address specific challenges and then breaking apart and moving on to whatever the next challenges. So I think the potential for power to be more fluid in some ways and exerted in different ways on different issues. But I think we still have a lot to discuss there and thinking about how that moves forward. Do I get to ask another question now? Okay. The next question I had, obviously this project can so often be very pessimistic, frankly. In our reports, we don't get credit for talking about positive developments in the future, right? But since we are in the happiest country in the world, I wanted to ask each of you what you're most optimistic about when you look to the future.
Shall I start? Well, I think for me, what's really kind of a promising perspective is something to do with paid work. Since we are living in a post-materialistic society already, and most of the kind of basic needs are already fulfilled, and so far the increase in productivity has always turned into increased earnings, not to reduced work time. But that's another opportunity to make this trade-off of not increasing the earnings any longer, but to exchange this increase in productivity to reduced work time, which would allow you to pursue many other things in your life, like taking care of your loved ones or having hobbies. And since we have huge opportunities in digital technologies to replace human labor, and that's normally taken as a dystopia, as a kind of a very bad thing. It's going to just, ruin our labor force, and it's going to bring up a collapse to our societies. But you could also look at it from a more positive perspective and think that, perhaps we can, our Prime Minister, just before she took the job, proposed that we're going to have a 4-day work week. But we could go even further and think about just, like the nobleman in the old Greek times, when they thought that paid work is not something for good living. So at that time they had women and slaves who did the work, but I hope that in the future it's going to be the machines and computers, and we can pursue other things in life.
Yes, I think I can echo Heikki that the automation will bring a lot of jobs back from Asia because of the power it gives for the local economies. But more on what I see positive at this time is the kind of the raise of individuals' voice, and we see the My Data movement now being global, also in Asia trending, and showing that there's need for human-centric model for managing the rights that have been maybe given in the GDPR for Europeans, but they are not actionable rights. So kind of how we can amplify the effect of that to give the power to the people and bring back the democracies, bring back the open internet, because you can use that tool into many to challenge the monopolistic structures if so wanted. So there is a tribe that is challenging the current kind of negative impacts, and we see that is a positive trend, and that is a global trend.
I actually had a similar thing related to the power of the people and Greta Thunberg, but also there is still empathy towards others and children and younger generations. They're doing a lot of things better than myself and older generations. Another thing is the expanding scientific knowledge. So we do have a lot more knowledge on the environmental science, how societies work, about health, and also I'm quite happy to see that in many places it's increasingly used to inform policy making. So I think this kind of science policy interaction. And also I think the international, like the data and the digital technologies and everything, I think it's enabled us to live in an increasingly international world, even if we don't travel.
I had the same point.
Well, happiness, it was already referred to that we are very happy nation. Actually, when Gallup International made a global polling on the issue, called 60,000 people around the world, and they asked a simple question: how many minutes or hours per day are you feel happy? And surprisingly, the Finns answer them, that they feel the longest time happy during a single day, and it causes in Finland quite a lot of mixed emotions and feelings, because the kind of the civil religion of Finland, which is very Protestant and very Lutheran, considers happiness to be a little bit sinful behavior. So I don't know if we are very, what is the composition of that happiness, but I see that this idea, this cosmopolitan idea that global cities somehow can distribute work so efficiently that it can give free time for different things. Yes, it has occurred, and we feel happiest here. We are living kind of the peak of perhaps this cosmopolitan times, but my worry, being a Finn, I worry a lot, and that's an expression of happiness in a way. I can see that it is an unsustainable situation, so I don't see that it would be kind of the solution or end result. One good thing that I see is that politics is back. The end of history paradigm has ended, and the world is shifting and in transition, perhaps in an agitated and extremely stimulated way, but even in polarized societies, and especially in polarized society, for example in US, people's interest in politics has dramatically increased. So there's, polarization also brings interest in politics, and politics is the kind of the heart of the matter. And if people are interested, and there's no single solution anymore, one single trend that is pointing forward, like the emergence of liberal cosmopolitan utopias, and somehow kind of a rationally calculated architecture between those. I see that there is some seeds of new stories to be told, and cognitive empowerment of different people, but the counter side of that is that it causes factions inside democracies, it causes turbulence, and it can be a regressive process that causes also then the resurgence of those powerful states that can of course then go through upheavals, because the transition in autocracies, the power transition is always problematic. So autocracy is not a solution, but there's turbulence, but there's pockets of happiness, and but quite a lot of worry and sweating and fever.
I'd like to actually add one thing that I'm hopeful about, and that's the increase in futures literacy skills. The planetary living skills, creativity skills, complexity skills, empathy, what you mentioned, empathy skills, these all are increasing our futures literacy, which is then leading into higher resilience. And I think this is something we need.
Well, thank you all very much. I think, are we near our end of time? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. It is a very tight day, because what we'd also like to hear are your views and your questions, and we'd like to open the floor to the questions that you might have for either Erin or for the panelists. Who wants to answer?
Well, we are working on to fix that liability issue for sure. So those are the kind of things that we as regulators need to see because of the foresight work we do, what kind of new challenges there is, how our regulative system at the moment can answer to the new questions. And there is a lack on some kind of solutions, but we have to solve those. And we are already proceeding in our sector, for instance, creating the kind of a liability model based on risks and how we manage, structure and govern. So, yes.
I can just very quickly react on. I mean, I completely agree that globally there's still a massive amount of fossil fuel subsidies and many governments somehow support it. And I think the problem is that what we need is a destabilization or destruction of the old harmful policies, but that's politically really difficult. And it's much easier to introduce these kind of renewable energy support or other types of sort of favorable policies, and until the politicians are kind of ready to upset the people who are benefiting from the existing systems, I feel like it's impossible. So it's not really a solution, it's just a statement of the reality.
May I ask if we have some microphones here in the front or there?
Hello, I'm Mikko. Very much thanks for excellent discussion. Very sort of interesting. I'm asking about technologies. In Finland, we are very good at analyzing emerging technologies from many fields. Now, Erin, you said in the introduction that you are looking at the sort of a cross impacts, intersects over trends. So my question is that, do you analyze systematically these emerging technologies through their kind of a societal impacts and impacts over impacts and the impacts over impacts over impacts?
That's a great question. We attempt to do that, right? We do, as I said, we do the quantitative analysis, so data-driven analysis to identify what those new emerging technologies might be. And then the qualitative aspect of looking at how those technologies, what the impacts may be going forward. One of the ways we do this is through scenarios analysis, which is always included in the Global Trends reports, where we try and take one or two key factors and look at how those factors intersect and then describe what the worlds might look like when those factors intersect. I think it's really hard to predict, frankly, the social impacts of a lot of these technologies. I think if you would have asked us, 20 years ago to think about the role that cell phones play in people's lives, you wouldn't have been able to describe it correctly. But you can help. One of our goals of our product, because our main customer is US policymakers, is to help them think about decisions they're making now about these technologies, right? And about potential regulations of these technologies, how that will play out in the future going forward. It's certainly something we talk a lot about, and we try to include different perspectives and multiple perspectives, because I think there's no one answer on the societal impact of the technologies.
Hi, Simon Michaud from GTK, Geological Survey of Finland. I have two questions. I haven't heard anything today from the finance sector. So I have two questions. Question one, how do you see tax haven law influencing everything that has been discussed today? Tax havens. Second question, in the last 11 years, every central bank in the world has engaged in quantitative easing. In the last few months, there's been an unprecedented amount of quantitative easing seems to be flowing towards the Deutsche Bank. Could you give some insight or reflect on how you think those two issues might influence what we are discussing?
It is an important question, and kind of ties in with what Heikki was saying about the kind of the rise of the global oligarchy, and also my point on kind of the shadow and black flows of finance. So we have these kind of hubs, these places where the financial flows somehow touch upon. So these flow places, maritime flows, they created places like Singapore, Panama, that have special types of states, very dependent on the existence of global flows, not so much on the kind of the regional and territorial issues. So the tax havens and the financial flows, you can see there kind of a formation of new types of spaces, and also kind of the shadow flow and the rise of oligarchy that is very intimately connected, and it has certain resemblance of the old royal system in Europe that was maintaining stability through interactions and intermarriages. So that's something, it is a trend that still kind of a perhaps weak but important trend that should be looked upon, how kind of the flow oligarchs are political nodal points, and how they are empowered through their interconnectedness and the ability to bypass taxation systems and regulation. And that creates byproducts. Those oligarchs are based in certain places, certain countries where inequality is big. So you kind of create tensions through the kind of the shadow flows and the financial flows between the kind of the nation state. Inside the nation states, you can easily in the future can see political regressions in those autocracies, but that network is also based in democracies, and it can influence also democratic outcomes and processes. But this is a little bit, it's an area of study that should be paid more attention to, also from the kind of a more geostrategic perspective.
Heikki.
Well, I guess there are kind of two ways to look for foresight. One is to look for kind of linear trends, and one is to look for places of disruptions. And if you give me 20 years, I'll predict that we're going to have another global economic collapse, even before the first decennium. So, and that's mainly because of the fact that after the the previous global economic recession, there was a kind of a window of opportunity for huge re-regulation of the financial sector, which has just gone over the proportions. I remember attending a conference where there was the CEO of Deutsche Bank who said that we need to show the society that we are actually making something useful. But that kind of attitude has somehow disappeared. And there's probably we need another collapse to change the attitudes and start regulating the financial markets.
Just adding, and that's all connected. It's also connected with the power over the states, the cities that was very much emphasized in the discussion. Those financial hubs are the major cities, and they're interconnected. So in a way that kind of a cosmopolitan utopia is based on this system of flows. So kind of the good side of it comes with the package. And should be recognized, and that also creates cleavages when these hubs are kind of ripped from their geographical location, creates cleavages between inside countries, like what you can see in Finland right now. The property values kind of collapsing in the rural areas and increasing drastically in the main hub, which is basically Helsinki nowadays in Finland.
I saw a question from Itonde Kakoma from CMI.
Thank you. My question relates to the shifting power dynamics that you raised and was the focus of the discussion group I was in. Can you elaborate on the implications of shifting power dynamics, at least along the following lines? And my question to Erin in particular, one with respect to the sustainable resolution of conflicts. The US has prioritized at least the following in terms of peace mediation during this administration: Afghanistan, North Korea, Israel-Palestine questions. So what are the implications of these shifting global dynamics in terms of resolving complex conflicts? And two, there is considerable analysis on what shifting power dynamics means for the transference to somewhere else. And is that possible to transfer power without war? And some have argued that the transference of power from, say, the United Kingdom to that of the United States post-wars was one of the only peaceful transferences of power. Is that feasible in the context that we're discussing today?
Those are excellent questions. I'll tackle the first one first on resolution of current conflicts and shifting power dynamics. I think one of the key challenges is this move away from the unipolar moment, right, to a place of potentially bipolarity on the geopolitical scale. Means in terms of resolving conflicts, conflicting parties have multiple options, if you will, in a way that perhaps they didn't previously, and perhaps the United States doesn't exert quite as much influence as it once did in these arenas. And also the shift away from the multilateral system, right, and the respect given to the multilateral system to resolve conflicts or play a mediating role when large powers step back from those institutions, then smaller powers take that as a sign that they can step back as well. And so perhaps conflicts become more difficult to mediate because the institutions that we rely on in the international system don't have the same power anymore. So I do think the shifting power dynamics influence, perhaps in a negative way, frankly, the ability to mediate some of these conflicts. On your second question, remind me now, it was on war, yes. So the Thucydides trap, right, is what you're referring to, I think. I think it's an open question. I certainly hope that war isn't inevitable in the shifting of power dynamics, and I don't think it is. I think it's a question of when we talk about conflict, what we actually mean, and as we see a lot of conflict shifting to the hybrid zone, to the quote-unquote gray zone, right, of trying to do everything up to the line where it shifts over into hot conflict, I think you'll certainly see a lot of jockeying there. You already are seeing a lot of jockeying in that area, but I think because of what we've been talking about with technology and other issues, there's a lot of ways to compete and put pressure on one another in that system that doesn't necessarily result in, armies going at one another on land or in the high seas. I'm sure other folks on the panel have comments as well.
Our time is up, but before I let the panelists go, I would like to hear from our chairs sort of what would be that one message, that one thing you would want to give Erin to think about, or that's something, what is sort of your core message now, she going and preparing the Global Trends report or finalizing the preparations, and then from Erin, perhaps some reflections from you.
Well, I suppose the core message has been already expressed, and perhaps I would like to accentuate Erin's own point on these domains being kind of the focal point of major power competition. That I see is also the context where decisive global challenges are tackled or left untackled. So that's kind of the heart of the matter, how those domains are competed over, and that kind of the last question and answer to that. The threshold for major power war is extreme because we are living in nuclear age, so there's a kind of a ceiling to power transition contestations. So what would that energy then, if it's channeled through the domains, how would that look like in different critical domains? One possible scenario that should be perhaps looked into.
Well, you already recognized that, or told that how the climate change is the challenge, and I'd just like to emphasize that whereas before it was treated as an environmental problem, it's clearly an environmental, social, and an economic problem, and how we solve it. And I think the UN Sustainable Development Goals are kind of a good tool to start thinking about how we can solve this, but also maybe you can look into kind of both adaptation, not in an environmental sense, but all in economic and social and environmental sense, and also the resilience of societies and what are the points of resilience that we can utilize.
Well, it seems likely that in the coming decades, migration in different forms will be a key feature of our world. Increasing urbanization, international migration, of course, a little bit more open where it goes. What is characteristic for international migration in particular? It's per definition has to do with agency of several states, and in that connection, those international agreements that there are, including the Global Compact for Migration and so on, still provide a rather good avenue to work towards. It's related to the Sustainable Development Goals in many respects. So I don't see as, let's say, as a future that I would like to see myself a system of international migration which is highly conflictual, but rather to try to find the common denominators in that. So I think it's something that would benefit also the sending countries as well as the receiving countries.
Well, my last notion is more on the motivational side of this foresight work. I think if the regulators and the governments keep their front row position, they are in a position to take the decisions to lead the development of new technologies. If they do not make the decisions, it's a decision still to be left outside or be left to the past. So this is something we just have to tackle.
Just as present is future socially constructed, so the stories we tell about the future also create the future. So that's why I would like to very much emphasize your second point and leave this opportunity to imagine the future in 2040, which could be better for everyone than 2020.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think my first takeaway is that I'm very grateful to have been here and had the opportunity to learn from all of you and the room today. You've given us a lot of good food for thought. And I think, substantively, two key takeaways. for me is one is this conversation has reinforced how critical it is for us to do our analysis at multiple levels and really make sure we focus as much on the individual level and how these trends are playing out in local communities as well as at that high politics international system level. And it's the interplay between those that is critical to understand. And the second for me is being comfortable with this idea that you can have trends pointing in opposite directions and pushing against each other at the same time, and kind of understanding how those tension points develop and exploring alternative futures as to how those tension points may play out. Could potentially be some of the most added value we provide in this report. So again, I really thank you. I thank the panel and Jaana for pulling this together. I know she's up very, very late last night making sure this all works smoothly, and I really appreciate her help and support in all of this.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for coming to the House of the Commons. It has been an amazing and interesting day. I have learned a lot. Thank you for the panelists. Thank you for the many people who have helped out in the workout group. So we had 5 chairs, but we had 14 people who were sort of chairing these questions within those bigger themes. So we had a lot of people helping out today. So a big thank you for you all. And thank you. Let's be positive about the future. Thank you so much.